SBO is the best.
Alright, let's lock in. So in this video, by the end of this video, you'll be able to define and calculate key values such as heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, breathing frequency, tidal volume, and minute ventilation. You'll be able to explain the cardiac cycle and the heart's conduction system, be able to explain how blood flow gets redirected during exercise in a process known as vascular shunting, be able to explain mechanisms of venous return, be able to explain breathing mechanics and control of breathing, be able to explain gaseous exchange and why oxyhemoglobin lets go of oxygen more easily during hard exercise, and lastly be able to apply it all to altitude and heat. The cardiovascular system and respiratory system are two systems working as a team. The cardiovascular system, made up of the heart and the blood vessels, its main job is transportation. And this is important because transporting blood allows it to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the working muscles and to remove waste like carbon dioxide. The respiratory system, its main job is gaseous exchange and ventilation. This is important to be able to get oxygen into the blood and CO2, carbon dioxide, out of the blood. In sport, performance improves when we can deliver more oxygen to the muscles, remove CO2 faster, maintain output for longer, and recover quicker. So that is the whole idea of what these two systems are working to achieve. Now let's look at the cardiovascular system at rest. So these are the key cardiovascular system terms you need to know and their values, which we're going to look at shortly. At rest, so heart rate, the definition is the number of heartbeats per minute. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of the left ventricle per beat, and it's measured in milliliters per beat. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart per beat, measured in liters per beat. And this golden equation here, cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume, tells you the relationship between these three values. And the relationship is that if heart rate goes up and stroke volume stays the same, then cardiac output will go up. If stroke volume goes up and heart rate stays the same, then cardiac output goes up. If both heart rate and stroke volume go up, then cardiac output goes up by a lot. So that's the relationship between these three values. And now for typical values in trained and untrained individuals, these are the values that you should be familiar with. So as you can see, this table shows you different values, typical values for untrained individuals at rest, trained individual at rest, and maximum values for these three terms. Okay, now let's talk about the cardiac cycle. Whenever you hear cardiac cycle, think of two phases, the diastole phase and the systole phase. The diastole phase is when the heart muscle relaxes and chambers fill with blood. Basically, this is the filling phase. The systole phase is the pumping phase, when the heart muscle contracts and blood is pushed out or ejected. So remember, diastole is filling and systole is pumping. And the key link you need to understand for this course is that the cardiac cycle is coordinated by the conduction system of the heart. So the conduction system helps to actually enable the cardiac cycle to happen. And these are the 5 steps in which that happens. So first step is that the sinoatrial node releases an electrical impulse. The sinoatrial node is a node found in your right atrium, and that node releases an electrical impulse, and that impulse then spreads, which leads us to step 2. That signal spreads and it causes the atria to contract. So when it spreads, it causes your right and your left atria to contract. And what is contraction? Systole, like we spoke about here. And then we go on to the next step, where the atrioventricular node, which is found somewhere in the middle between the right atrium and the right ventricle, the atrioventricular node gets that electrical impulse, but it doesn't release it just yet. It just holds it and it delays the impulse from being released. And that's because it's waiting for the ventricles to fully fill up with blood before it releases that impulse. And then what happens, step 4, when it's released the impulse then travels down via the bundle of hairs. And then step 5, it travels into the Purkinje fibers, and this causes it to create a ventricular systole, which again just means it causes the ventricles to contract and pump out with blood. Okay, quick visual of what happens here so you can understand it better. The sinoatrial node here found in the right ventricle releases the impulse, the electrical impulse. The electrical impulse causes both atria to contract, so they squeeze blood down into the ventricles, and then that impulse travels to the atrioventricular node. Then the atrioventricular node gets that impulse. Thank you very much. It keeps that impulse, it delays it just for a little while it waits for both ventricles to fill up with blood. And then when both ventricles fill up with blood, which is called diastole, because remember, diastole is when the heart muscles contract and fill up, meanwhile systole is when the heart muscles contract and pump. So once the ventricles are filled up with blood, the atrioventricular node then sends that impulse down the bundle of hairs. Think of the bundle of hairs as this structure running down the septum here, and then that impulse travels down the bundle of hairs and goes into the Purkinje fibers. Think of the Purkinje fibers as these extension structures that run along the walls of the heart here. And then once that impulse reaches the Purkinje fibers, it gets released and it causes ventricular systole, where both ventricles squeeze, contract, and pump blood out of the heart. So remember to link the conduction system to the cardiac cycle. So the key thing you want to be mentioning when you get asked a question like this in the exam is that the electrical impulse from the sinoatrial node or SA node causes atrial systole, and then the atrioventricular node or the AV node delays that impulse to allow ventricular filling, and then the impulse travels through the bundle of hairs and the Purkinje fibers to cause ventricular systole. Very simple. Alright, now let's talk about the effects of exercise on the cardiovascular system and also what happens during recovery. So during exercise, heart rate increases. Heart rate increases as exercise intensity increases. Why? Because working muscles demand more oxygen, so the heart beats faster so it can pump more blood and transport more oxygen around the body. Also, stroke volume increases as you go from rest to around moderate intensity, and it usually plateaus, which means it stays the same once you get to high intensities of exercise depending on your fitness level. And why does stroke volume increase? It increases because it allows for more venous return, stronger contraction of the heart, and better filling of the heart as well, which in turn allows greater pumping of blood around the body. Cardiac output also increases. Why? Same reasons, to pump more blood around the body for oxygen delivery and to remove waste. And if you link back to our golden formula we saw before, cardiac output equals to heart rate times stroke volume, we have both heart rate and stroke volume increasing. Therefore, we have a really huge increase in cardiac output during exercise. And during recovery, all of these values go back to their resting values. Also, during exercise, we have something interesting called vascular shunting that happens. And vascular shunting is basically the redistribution or redirection of blood to where it's needed the most. So you see a decrease in blood flow from places that are non-essential or inactive, such as the kidney, the stomach, and areas like that, and an increase in blood flow towards places that are active, such as the working muscles, the heart, and the skin. And this decrease in blood flow is something known as vasoconstriction, and the increase in blood flow is vasodilation. What's actually happening is that blood vessels known as arterioles are reducing in diameter. For vasoconstriction, blood vessels known as arterioles are actually squeezing and getting smaller, and the diameters are reducing, and that is vasoconstriction because they are constricting. Meanwhile, for vasodilation, blood vessels called the arterioles are expanding. The diameters are opening up and they are increasing in circumference and diameter to be able to allow more blood to travel to these working muscles, the heart muscles, and the skin. And we have something called a vasomotor center, which is the control center that regulates this process of vascular shunting. So the vasomotor center is a control center found in your brain in a structure called the medulla oblongata, and it helps to control blood vessel diameter via the autonomic nervous system. So how does it do this? We've looked at one way it does this using the arterioles with vasodilation and vasoconstriction, which we spoke about up here. Another way it does it is using precapillary sphincters. So precapillary sphincters are little structures, like little muscular gates found at the entrance to capillaries. So they basically control how much blood enters capillaries. So if they open, then that means more blood is entering the capillaries. If they're closed, then that means less blood is entering the capillaries. So they open where the blood is needed the most, such as at the working muscles, the heart muscle, the skin, and they close where blood is not needed as much, such as the kidney and the stomach. So that is what the vasomotor center is responsible for. So again, quick recap for whenever you're asked a question on this. Remember that during exercise, arterioles to the working muscles vasodilate, which means they widen, and precapillary sphincters open. And arterioles to non-essential areas vasoconstrict, so they narrow, and the precapillary sphincters close. And the result of this is you get more blood flow to muscles and less blood flow to places that don't really need it as much. All right, now let's talk about the mechanisms of venous return. Venous return simply means getting blood back to the heart. And the key mechanisms to learn are the skeletal muscle pump, which is where muscles contract to squeeze veins to be able to push blood back towards the heart. You can see I've drawn a little diagram of a vein in your legs, and you have muscles around the veins found in your legs. When these muscles contract, so maybe you're just walking around, you're climbing up the stairs, the muscles in your foot are contracting and they are actually squeezing on the vein. So think about how you squeeze a toothpaste tub, and that squeezing causes the toothpaste to travel in one direction. Same thing with the muscles squeezing on that vein. Let's say these are the muscles squeezing on either side of the vein, and blood is able to travel upwards towards the heart. This is the skeletal muscle pump. And then we move on to the next one, which is the respiratory pump. The respiratory pump is very straightforward. It's when breathing changes the pressure in the chest and the abdomen, and this helps to be able to pull blood back towards the heart, especially during deeper breathing. Next, we have vasoconstriction. This is coordinated by the vasomotor center, which causes veins to squeeze blood up towards the heart. So it's like the skeletal muscle pump, but it's coordinated by the vasomotor center instead of the skeletal muscle. So the brain, the vasomotor center found in the brain, basically tells the veins to squeeze, and they squeeze blood up towards the heart, and they increase the blood pressure in the veins, which causes the blood to speed back towards the heart. And we also have gravity. Gravity is important for blood that is found above the heart, so in your head, in your neck, to be able to bring that blood back down to the heart. Now let's talk about regulation of heart rate. These are the factors that actually tell your heart when to speed up, when to slow down, and how that happens. So we're going to look at these three categories: the neural factors, the hormonal factors, and the intrinsic factors. So starting with the neural factors, this is all about the autonomic nervous system, and we have two parts of the autonomic nervous system to know about. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And the way this simply works is that the sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate. So heart rate increases when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, and the parasympathetic nervous system decreases heart rates. And it does this through a very important nerve called the vagus nerve. And this is what's activated when you are resting, when you're sleeping. The parasympathetic nervous system is activated. Next, we have the hormonal factors. All you need to know is that adrenaline and noradrenaline increase heart rate and force of contraction during exercise or during times of stress. Adrenaline is also referred to as epinephrine. Next, we have the intrinsic factors, and these are more built in things that happen, like really built into the heart, and they come from the heart and the circulatory system itself. So factors to be familiar with when we talk about intrinsic factors are temperature. So if temperature increases in the heart, then heart rate increases. And if temperature drops, then heart rate usually drops as well. The sinoatrial node obviously conducts that release of the electrical impulse. If it releases a stronger impulse, then heart rate and force of contraction is stronger and is higher. And if it releases a weaker impulse, then heart rate will likely be smaller as well. Next, we have electrolytes, which can play a part in determining if heart rate increases or decreases. The Bainbridge reflex is basically what happens where venous return increasing causes the atria to stretch and open up more, and this in turn causes an increase in heart rate. All right, now let's talk about the respiratory system at rest, and let's define some key terms you need to know. So breathing frequency is simply the number of breaths per minute. Tidal volume is the volume of air in each breath. So it could be the volume of air breathed out per breath or breathed in per breath. Minute ventilation is the total volume of air breathed per breath. And again, this is another golden equation for the respiratory system, that minute ventilation is equal to tidal volume times breathing frequency. Okay, for mechanics of breathing, we're going to look at what happens during inspiration and expiration, both at rest and during exercise. Inspiration basically just means inhalation, so breathing in. Expiration is exhalation, so breathing out. And it's really important to be familiar with the different parts of the respiratory system, so the diaphragm, intercostal muscles, the chest cavity, the rib cage, and all of that. So if you're not familiar with the different parts of the respiratory system, I urge you to go watch the previous video for OCR A level to get familiar with that before coming back. So let's start with inspiration, breathing in at rest. What happens is that the diaphragm contracts and flattens. The external intercostals then contract, and this causes the ribs to move up and out, and this causes chest cavity volume to increase, so the space in the chest gets bigger, and as a result pressure in the lungs decreases, and this allows air to flow in. Now for expiration at rest, all of the muscles relax, so the intercostal muscles have relaxed, the diaphragm has relaxed, and this causes chest volume to decrease, and pressure in the lungs, in the chest, increases, and as a result this causes air to flow out. It's also important to know that expiration at rest is a passive process because muscles are not contracting. Meanwhile, as you can see, inspiration at rest is an active process because we have muscles contracting. Now, inspiration during exercise is slightly different. Some slight changes you need to add when you're explaining it. So what happens is that the diaphragm contracts and it flattens more. It flattens further. So whenever you're talking about mechanics of breathing during exercise, you always want to emphasize that it's more, it's further, it's greater, because that's what happens. Next, we have the external intercostals contract to lift the ribs and the sternum up and out more or further. And then we have some muscles that contract. So you can state the sternocleidomastoid, the scalene, or the pectoralis, or you can state all of them that are able to contract to expand the rib cage more. And in turn, this causes chest volume to increase and lung pressure decreases, and this causes air to move into the lungs much more quickly or more. So you always want to be emphasizing that it's happening more, it's happening further, and it's happening on a greater scale. Now, for expiration during exercise, what happens is that the diaphragm relaxes and comes back up. The abdominals contract to push the diaphragm up more. Then the intercostal muscles, internal intercostals to be specific, contract to pull the ribs down and in further or more. So further, more. And this causes chest volume to decrease, and therefore the pressure in the lungs increases, and as a result air is forced out of the lungs. So as you can see, during exercise, inspiration and expiration are both active, and everything happens further, it happens more quickly. So it's important to refer to that when you're doing your analysis to be able to pick up those extra marks. All right, now let's talk about gaseous exchange. Gaseous exchange is super straightforward once you understand how it works in the alveoli and at the muscles. Sometimes students might get this confused because they're not able to see a visual of it, so I drew quick diagrams to be able to illustrate this better. So this is an alveoli here, this little air sac bubble here. So what happens at the alveoli in the lungs is that oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood. So what happens is you've inhaled oxygen through your mouth, through your nose. It's traveled down the trachea, it's gone into the bronchus, it's traveled down the bronchioles, and now it's arrived at the alveoli. This oxygen has to get into your blood somehow. And the way that happens is that the oxygen diffuses into the blood. So these green dots are oxygen diffusing into the blood from the alveoli. And what happens is that you have a waste in the blood, CO2, and that waste, which is CO2, diffuses from the blood into the alveoli, and that CO2 is later exhaled. And this blood vessel, which is important for diffusion, is the capillary. So that's what gaseous exchange is in the lungs, specifically at the alveoli. Now we're looking at gaseous exchange in the muscles. What happens is that oxygen diffuses from the blood into the muscle cells. So oxygen is diffusing into the muscle cells, but this time CO2 is diffusing from the muscle cells into the blood, right? Because we're moving, we're exercising, and that's creating waste like CO2, and we need to get rid of that waste somehow. So that CO2 diffuses from the muscles into the blood, into this capillary as well, and that CO2 gets carried to the alveoli, and then it gets diffused into the alveoli and it gets exhaled. Meanwhile, that oxygen gets diffused into the muscles and it gets used for aerobic respiration, which basically means it gets used to be able to release energy. And with gaseous exchange and with diffusion, always remember that diffusion happens down a pressure gradient. This means diffusion always happens when a substance is moving from an area of high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So here in the alveoli, oxygen is moving from a high partial pressure in the alveoli into the capillaries where there is a low partial pressure of oxygen. Meanwhile, carbon dioxide is moving from high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the capillary into the alveoli because there's a lower partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli. Meanwhile, at the muscles, oxygen is moving from a high partial pressure in the capillaries into a lower partial pressure of oxygen in the muscles, and CO2 is diffusing from a high partial pressure in the muscles to a low partial pressure of CO2 in the capillary. So remember, it's always happening down a pressure gradient from high to low. Alright, now let's explore the effects of exercise on the respiratory system and also what happens during recovery. So, during exercise, as exercise intensity increases, breathing frequency increases, tidal volume increases, and minute ventilation increases a lot, because if you remember our golden formula, minute ventilation VE is equals to breathing frequency times tidal volume. So because breathing frequency is increasing, tidal volume is increasing, then minute ventilation increases by a lot. And during recovery, when you've stopped exercising, then all these values return back to their resting values. Okay, now let's talk about regulation of breathing. We've spoken about regulation of heart rate and the factors that go into that. Now we're going to do similar thing for regulation of breathing. When we talk about regulation of breathing, you need to talk about neural and chemical control. Neural control happens in the brain stem, and this is what adjusts your breathing rhythm. Chemical control happens with chemoreceptors, which detect changes in CO2, in carbon dioxide, in hydrogen ions, which basically links to pH level, which is able to tell of the acidity in the blood. So if pH level is lower, then that means the blood is more acid, and if pH level is higher, then the blood is less acidic. And chemoreceptors also detect oxygen levels, O2 levels. And the way neural control works is that it's able to detect when exercise is increasing, when activity is increasing, due to certain receptors that it has in the body, and this allows it to either be able to increase the breathing rate, the tidal volume during exercise, or to decrease it when you've stopped exercising. And for chemical control, if CO2 increases and the blood becomes more acidic, then it will trigger an increase in ventilation to be able to remove CO2 faster. So when you're describing the role of chemoreceptors, you want to focus on CO2 and pH levels. So you want to say something like, as CO2 increases and pH level drops during intense exercise, chemoreceptors stimulate an increase in ventilation to remove CO2 and to restore pH level. Okay, let's talk about oxyhemoglobin dissociation. Before we move on to the last part of this video, this is a key phenomenon that happens during exercise, and you should be able to explain it by talking about changes in pressure gradient and changes in the dissociation of oxyhemoglobin. So changes in pressure gradient during exercise means that working muscles use oxygen fast and they produce loads of CO2. So at the muscles, because oxygen is being used, the oxygen pressure drops. Meanwhile, the CO2 pressure increases, or in other words, the partial pressure of oxygen in the muscles drops and the partial pressure of CO2 in the muscles increases. This creates a steeper pressure gradient, and this gives way to what we call the Bohr shift. So the Bohr shift is a result of oxyhemoglobin dissociation. And the way to really understand why there is a change in oxyhemoglobin dissociation, we have to break it down and actually talk about what hemoglobin does, what oxygen does, and what dissociation is. So we have hemoglobin, which was spoken about. Hemoglobin is one of the components of blood that is responsible for binding with oxygen and transporting oxygen. And the way hemoglobin and oxygen interact is that they have an affinity to each other. So affinity kind of means an attraction, right? So if oxygen sees hemoglobin, it's almost like a magnet. They immediately rush to each other and they give each other a big hug. So they have an affinity for each other. And when they bind, they become oxyhemoglobin, because oxygen and hemoglobin mix together. But the greater the affinity is, even though that means that there's a greater attraction and oxygen binds much more quickly and much more effectively to hemoglobin, that also means it's a lot harder for oxygen to dissociate from hemoglobin. So, yes, greater affinity means oxygen can associate a lot quickly and a lot easy. It can hug hemoglobin a lot easily and a lot more. But when it comes time to letting go of that hug, from dissociating, then it gets harder to dissociate. But in the muscles, think about it. During exercise, doing hard exercise in the muscles, you don't want oxygen to find it hard to dissociate from hemoglobin. You want that hemoglobin should be able to let go of oxygen and be able to allow it to diffuse into the muscles easily, right? And so the conditions of the muscles are able to enable this. And the conditions are the conditions that we spoke about before, such as higher CO2 and a lower pH level. These conditions make it harder for oxygen to bind to hemoglobin. So it reduces hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. So affinity is a key term whenever we're talking about oxyhemoglobin dissociation. So higher CO2 and a lower pH level in the blood reduces hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, meaning oxygen and hemoglobin are not that attracted to each other anymore. When they see each other, they don't hug each other as strongly anymore. And this also means that when it's time to let go of that hug, oxygen can much more easily let go and be transported to the muscles. And this is what we call the Bohr shifts. Okay, so let's say this is the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve before the Bohr shift, and it would look something like this after the Bohr shift. And the Bohr shift is this rightward shift of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, which basically makes it much easier to let go of oxygen into the muscles, which is exactly what you want at the muscles during exercise. So that is what you need to know when you're talking about oxyhemoglobin dissociation. All right, lastly, let's link everything we've spoken about to altitude and heat. So starting with altitude. Altitude basically means any elevation that is 2,400 meters and above sea level. And what happens at altitude is that you have a lower oxygen availability, which means you have to rely on an increased ventilation and increased heart rate to be able to get enough oxygen into the body. And the longer time you spend at altitude, you experience something called acclimatization. Acclimatization means your body adapts to the altitude and it can cope better to the conditions of altitude. And exercise in heat means you experience something called cardiovascular drift. And cardiovascular drift can be shown on a diagram like this. Cardiovascular drift is something that happens during prolonged exercise in heat. And this is where more blood is sent to the skin when you're exercising in heat, right? And also, in addition to more blood being sent to the skin, we also sweat more when we're exercising in heat. And this sweat means we lose some fluid from the blood. So the blood effectively becomes thicker. This increased thickness in the blood leads to a decrease in stroke volume, and heart rate rises to be able to maintain cardiac output. Because if you remember from our golden formula, cardiac output equals to heart rate times stroke volume. If the blood is thicker, it's harder to pump out blood from the heart per beat. So stroke volume has decreased because you're pumping out less blood per beat. But to be able to maintain cardiac output, the heart rate increases even more. The blood pumps out even more to be able to maintain cardiac output. And the way we can show this on a diagram is like this. We have heart rate increases, and then we have stroke volume increases, and then it starts to decrease, and then we have cardiac output that stays relatively constant. So that's cardiac output right there. So what happens is that during prolonged exercise, usually around the after the 20-minute mark, when you've been exercising continuously for 20 minutes, what you experience is you start sweating, you're losing water, so plasma volume decreases, so the blood becomes more viscous because you have less fluid in the blood. So the heart starts beating more because stroke volume has decreased, and that happens to be able to maintain cardiac output. So again, just in writing, this is what happens. Alright, that's it for the video. As you can tell, we've spoken about quite a bit in this video, different difficult terms such as oxyhemoglobin dissociation and gaseous exchange, but they can be so straightforward as long as you practice them consistently. So, as always, I encourage you to check out our website, Super PE Online, for a bunch of revision and practice worksheets to be able to get you to ace your exams. All right, see you in the next video.